Hi, I'm Jennifer Campbell, creator and host of the Systemic Leadership Summit. Welcome to this session. And in this summit session, we'll be talking about the developing journey of the systems thinker. We'll discuss this session topic with someone who has done a lot of work with systems thinking based approaches in public services, and his name is Benjamin Taylor. Benjamin has been in public service reform and organizational effectiveness for over 20 years. He's always been an avid learner of systems thinking, which he traces back to reading his dad's science fiction, then studying philosophy, and being an outsider despite his privilege, as he mentions himself. He describes himself as a business evolutionary, and that's also something we'll get back to. He began work as a database developer, personal carer, and at youth development charity, then worked on the front line of a local authority advice center. He spent 7 years at the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham as advisor to leader before moving into consultancy and then became co-founder of a new model of consultancy in 2009 and established a social enterprise in 2016. He's very active in systems thinking and related societies and social media, and has been part of helping to set up a new systems thinking practitioner profession and adult apprenticeship in the UK. Now, more information about Benjamin can be found on our summit page and also in our membership area. Now, without further ado, a very warm welcome to you, Benjamin. Thank you so much for being here in the summit with us.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's an absolute pleasure as always.
Yes, and we're going to start with something that I mentioned of how you call yourself, and that is a business evolutionary and not a business revolutionary. Now, what does that mean, and how does that relate to being a systems thinker?
Well, I'm quite pleased with the phrase. At least it provokes interest. I think it means that I'm trying to be mature. It could be that I'm actually lost, and it certainly means I don't have the audacity or the chutzpah to think that I've got solutions. I think it relates to being a systems thinker, very much in that way of systems thinkers are often very good at understanding the risks of unintended consequences and the sort of second and third order effects of things that they do. But I'm also very much a practitioner. I'm involved in working with people in really difficult contexts with difficult to change organizations. So I can't advocate for revolution. I can only advocate for kind of real ongoing learning, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, it does. And this is exactly also the path that we'll be talking about today, about the journey, about the developmental journey of a systems thinker. And so when you develop yourself, there's always people you learn from who inspire you, and maybe whose shoulders you're standing on. So could you share with us whose shoulders are you standing on? Which approaches, concepts, ideas do you work with and embrace?
That's a really interesting question. So from the point of view of what we're talking about today, there is a whole slew of big names
Hmm.
that are core to me, and every systems thinker has these different constellations of influences. Barry Oshry, who's well represented often in your summits. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
But is an underappreciated systems thinker. Stafford
Mm,
Beer, Elliot Jacks, who perhaps is not, but maybe is a systems thinker, but has a huge contribution to management thinking, and I could name lots more systems thinkers and cyberneticians and complexity thinkers.
hmm.
There's a few that I'd like to sort of talk about a little bit. There's a guy called Teacher Tom who writes a blog about being a preschool teacher, and
Hmm.
um, it's an outdoor, messy, mostly outdoor preschool with kind of junk lying around, and his methodology, his praxis is about respecting the autonomy of the children.
Mm-hmm.
And very often it's about naming the thing and
Yeah.
enabling people to sort, kids in this case, people, to sort things out for themselves. So very often somebody will come to him, and as you read in the blogs, and say
Mm-hmm.
something like, "Teacher Tom, she took my toy away," and he'll
Yeah.
say, "She took your toy away," and allow the kid to take it from there, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So I think this is this respecting autonomy, naming the thing, and being somebody who names things and calls them to attention, is a core part of this. There's several. Let me name just two more, along with all those science fiction authors that I hinted about. One is Alistair McIntyre, the philosopher, and a chunk of philosophy, and his thinking, which I'll come back to later, which I've come back to after 24 years recently,
Mm-hmm.
of understanding, knowledge, meaning being embedded in practice and in community. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then another one, David Chapman, who writes at meaningless.com, who's a kind of a Buddhist thinker. He rejects the fact that he does philosophy, but he's talking about um, how to understand meaning and how to take more freeing stances towards our understanding of meaning in the world. So I'm kind of like deeply stewing. It used to
Mm-hmm.
be lots of podcasts. This year has been less podcasts because less
Yeah.
traveling, but more engagement with fellow travelers, sense makers, post-traditional Buddhists, the safety people. I've got a great long list of all these people who are systems thinkers, whether they like it or know it or not. And with community, with learning communities. SciO, the thing that I'm involved in, is just what got me really deeply going. It's the best learning community, or at least it was when I joined, for me,
Mm-hmm.
um, that I've ever come across, and because it was about really great systems thinkers connecting ideas, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it feels like that's a very empowering question. For me, it's not actually a canon anymore. It's a conversation between all of those things that I just talked about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, 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 it does. And there's so many things to unpack from there. But on what I just realized is that there's so many different viewpoints when it comes to systems thinkers. And so some things we'll probably be unpacking in this conversation. But the ingredients that you mentioned in terms of whose books you've read, whose approaches you've adopted, where you're looking to, what inspires you, what energizes you, is around the naming things, the meaning making, the connections from all um, different angles, and it's like that. What you then also feed back into the world to see, okay, it goes through me, and then I put it out there again in the different podcasts and so forth. So we're talking about being a systems thinker. And how would you define a systems thinker?
Oh no.
Yeah, because I
Oh, that's a
have
difficult
the
question,
I
Jennifer.
know, and it just popped up again. I'm like, well, we
Great.
have it in our topic for today.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
before I ask you about your journey,
Yes.
and also what it's not, or things that you have developed and also want to have offered, and that we'll be looking at. But
No, that's great.
yeah,
Uh,
but what's a systems thinker?
I mean,
What do
I
you?
think there are two really fundamental things which actually um, come into conflict here, and
Mm,
which I think I've got a sort of tentative resolution for.
mm-hmm,
Um, so on the one hand, I would say that a systems thinker is somebody who has an element of consciousness,
mm-hmm,
self-consciousness, awareness,
mm-hmm,
um, about the necessity, no, the potential first, that we are creating systems in our minds. Lots and lots of deep thinkers, this is
Mm-hmm.
one side of the kind of polarity, the tension, are
Yeah.
really clear that the only way in which there's a system is if there's an observer naming it as a system. Things go on regardless of us, and I'll probably come back to that. But
Yeah.
it's us seeing things that seem to correlate over a period of time, or where we can get some understanding, insight from doing that. And we fundamentally do that. We don't understand anything without having some kind of a way of looking at it. I'm trying to avoid very mechanistic, concrete words like conceptual framework or mindset or mental model. I don't
Mm.
think that's the point. Those are useful words when we've made them a bit more concrete and made them a bit more explicit. But that, we create the systems, right?
Yeah.
We frame and then make sense of the picture inside, how patterns form and connect, and we know that. Then the next stage is knowing that those are tentative, that we can redraw the frame, and that will allow us to see differently. So that's one side of it.
Mm-hmm.
But the other side is there are systems laws really do exist. There are
Yeah.
these really core counterintuitive laws that seem to illuminate aspects of how the world is, how people work, how society, organizations work. It's very hard to resist dualism in all of this, and the idea that I
Yeah.
have mental models in my head and that they may or may not reflect the real world. And I think it's a lot more embedded in levels of shared understanding than it is I have my mental model and the world is a system and is operating in a systemic kind of way. Does that make sense? That's the
Yeah.
tension. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I think that the potential resolution of that comes in two quotes, two short, mercifully short quotes. One is Wittgenstein, one of my heroes. To understand is to know what to do. And the second is
Mm-hmm.
Alistair McIntyre, another of my heroes, who says, I can only know what to do if I understand the story or stories of which I find myself a part.
Mm.
Um, so for me, those two things summarize the grounding of meaning, which is grounded in itself. It's grounded in the stories we tell, and I think that's incredibly humbling because it
Mm-hmm.
makes you realize that the world is infinitely complex. Everybody has their own unique perspectives. Um, uh, but we don't create any system. We create these systems, but we don't create them alone. So
Yeah.
for me, a systems thinker is somebody who's gone through, is moving around some of those phases of learning. And it's a powerful insight to say I can see systems in the world,
Yeah.
but it's an incomplete insight until you start to see the interplay of all of these things working together.
Yeah. Yeah. And the interplay of all these things working together, including you being the observer, and
Mm.
where the creating process of systems is presumed to start, really.
And the
Yeah.
fact that it's not sui generis, out of nothing, created by you.
No.
It's based on your embeddedness in society, in language, in understanding, in what does society mean? In contexts and groups and practices that allow the creation of meaning.
Yeah.
And then systems thinkers being a little bit aside, a little bit different from that, and often a little bit difficult and a little bit outsiders, and partly because of that insight. I can see how things work, but nobody else can see it.
Yeah.
Stand in a really interesting tension to that. And the risk is, one of the big risks, there's so many risks, we'll come to more of them, but that we spend so much time in this sort of cargo cult world. Cargo cult, I'm not sure is an expression we should be using anymore, because it's probably colonialist and nasty. What I mean is a good metaphor, though, because it means we're going through the motions when we're shooting words at each other and arguing about methodologies and theory,
Yeah.
and you know
Mm.
but if we're not in a practice that gives those a real embodied meaning,
Mm-hmm.
they're just words, very
Yeah.
often, and we're
Yeah.
usually arguing about different definitions and arguing past each other.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly, exactly. And I love how you also made the connection to the embodiment. This year in the summit, we have a couple of speakers who also tune into the embodied experience or embodied intelligence of systems. And so, uh, where I want to go next is that you, as a systems thinker, also articulated a number of, I think, four threats that you see when it
Yeah.
comes to systems thinking. And you feel that we should all be aware of them when approaching things systemically in general, but particularly also when we're dealing with a context of transformation or maybe even disruption that we're now experiencing on a massive scale. So, could you refresh our memories around what those threats
I
and
can.
systems
I
thinking
can.
are,
Yeah.
or introduce them to anyone who's hearing them for the first time?
Yeah. Well, of course, I'll give the caveat that this is a perspective. It's a model, and again,
Hmm.
I haven't divorced from the idea of using models, as some of my really good colleagues have. They've gone beyond that. But I do
Hmm.
think that models are all transitional objects to get to some kind of shared understanding,
Yeah.
and that's part of embodiment is really important, because that's one reason why this whole kind of mental models concept is not particularly where it's at. You know, because so take this all in that light. Let me say, yeah. So the four threats are really simple. You could call them a developmental journey, maybe, but you don't have to. They're constant temptations, and I use this framing to try and help keep me honest. So
Yeah.
so the first one is the naive enthusiasts. I've got this tool, this way of seeing, this way of understanding. A lot of people in the rationalist community, a lot of people getting into service design, process improvement. This was me.
Hmm.
This is how I got into systems thinking.
Yeah.
John Seddon was selling a version of kind of operational process improvement design, which was cool, but he was selling it with a hard. I'll come to him again in a minute. Um, uh, and I was like, wow, this has changed the world. Why don't they all let me run away and get all of this done? And this is amazing. And I had such a partial view, a powerful view, right? But really partial. And
Hmm.
thank goodness people kind of educated me. Or you can achieve a lot with that. Don't get me wrong. A happy tool head can achieve sometimes a huge lot more than a philosophizing, conflicted systems thinker. And so all of these roles have their value as well, and they're an important part of our ecosystem. The second risk, the first risk is to be a naive enthusiast. Here's the
Hmm.
thing, why won't you let me do it? It gets you into a lot of negativity if you're not careful, or it gets you into a lot of revolutionary, unthought through acts, which could be good or could be bad. The second
Yeah.
type is the systems popularizers, and I think there's a little bit of cynicism coming in here, and people taking that in one direction and saying, well, hey, this is great. And I can see, look, all these enthusiasts. There's a whole group of people who could follow this. But it's not accessible. I'm gonna make it really accessible, simplify, standardize, share. And those people tend to be about themselves and about getting a following.
Mm,
I would suggest, and
mm,
about a form of power. Um,
mm.
Another way you can go at different times, and I certainly felt the pull of this, although one of the points about this is that there's an inbuilt quality test, whether you can do it or not, is to be a guru. And I again, colonialist language, we have to be a little bit interested in the metaphors that we draw from. I spell this GOOROO, which a friend of mine, Arthur Batram, proposed, because to appropriate the concept of guru from the religion and from the is not nice, not helpful.
Mm.
But we have this image which got tagged onto that, and I had this great experience of being in a yoga based personality cult at university, that was only exposed a few years later. And that let me see that there was something about the public image, let's say, of John Seddon, of Vanguard Consulting, great
Mhm.
inspiration in many ways, but he was very much there as the guru figure. I have the enlightenment, I have the wisdom, you can get it all from me, And
Yeah,
you can
yeah.
obviously see the ego trap in all of these, and particularly in this one. The fourth one is probably the one I still have the hardest time resisting, which I call the curmudgeon.
Yeah.
The one who kind of knows better than everybody else, and why won't they just listen? And all those naive enthusiasts are foolish, and they should, and actually they should listen to why this didn't work the 17 times before, why all the
Mm.
waves of, well, this is going to transform the world didn't happen.
Yeah.
Thinks the systems popularizers are idiots and completely misinterpreting things, which in a sense they are. So there's a balancing force between them all. But though the naive enthusiasts, the systems popularizers, or the gurus and the curmudgeons. And saying that
Yeah.
word systems, by the way, one of my points is that systems, cybernetics, complexity, and probably some other things are so deeply intertwined,
Yeah.
that you can't actually those are you can't carve nature. You're not carving nature at the joints, as they say,
Hmm.
or as Aristotle or Plato or whoever said, if you separate them in that way. Um,
Hmm.
but there's so this all applies to all of that field, and probably a lot more, Jennifer.
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
And thank you
I don't know
so
if you've
much
felt the
for
pull of those
articulating
ego
them.
things, but yeah, yeah. I know I have. So
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing them again. And I love the word curmudgeons.
it's a great word,
For
isn't it?
me,
Lovely
it
word.
was a totally new word when I heard it first a while back. And can you take us on the journey then? Because this is what you see also as threats or as things to avoid going into too much. But you'll probably meet all of them along the way as you're
Mm,
developing as a systems thinker.
yes.
So, could you share with us where did you find yourself in the quadrant or the field where these four reside? And also, did anything change from a while back, a year back, or 2 years back, and taking it into the context that we are in now?
I'm less tempted by the guru trap now. And as I say, that's a vainglorious thing to say anyway, because who says I could be a guru? um, but there we go.
Well, it's
That's
your
the
systems thinking, so in your
Yeah, yeah.
mind,
Well, you've invited me, Jennifer. I'm a speaker at this summit with
yeah.
these
So
amazing people. So there you go.
yeah, but that doesn't make anyone a guru on my summit.
No, no,
They're
no,
just
but it
really interesting people
exactly,
to have
exactly.
conversations
Yeah.
with. That's how I describe it.
I'm just well aware of my own ego ticking away here. It's definitely, it's definitely saying things,
Yeah.
good and bad, of course. Yeah. So and at one stage I thought, look, I'm not making enough money. It's hard, and maybe I should just go for that, and I could do it decently and try and then I thought, no, I can't really do that. Um, I define the value of systems complexity cybernetics is in the value it can offer. Um, and what's interesting is, as I've relaxed about those things, and in a way I've sort of let go of the tension of wanting to be at least one of those, maybe all four of them. I've been more able to put myself out there, share my content, share the ideas, and so on. I think it's been a torrid year, really, Jennifer. I mean, there's been some grief, a lot of change, which implicitly feel involves grief in some ways. I don't feel that I've completely found my home yet. Um, and I am, I mean, the home. In a way, I sometimes wonder if we're just playing around here. And I have a little list that I keep. There's about 4 things that we should all really be doing in this space, I think. Permaculture, probably some form of therapy, so you can help the planet. You can do things properly by the biosphere. You can help people. You can do asset-based community development, and I keep a 4th slot open because there's a few things rotating around, and everything else might be a waste of time, to be honest. What I've noticed as well is that in listening to all of these podcasts and these fellow travelers that I talk about, the people from Safety Differently to Strong Towns, to sense making and Game B and everything else, so many of them have stopped their podcasts this year, are
Mm,
clearly going through grief and personal something,
yeah.
and are turning to communes, or as they're called now, intentional communities, are moving away, are stopping firing out words into the void and contributing to the noise, and a turning inward, and so on.
Hmm.
So I think that's really interesting. So I'm still in limbo, Jennifer, to some extent, and that's what I've realised this year,
Yeah.
and allowed myself to be there, I would say.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that because, well, for starters, I think that many people who are also watching this will resonate, and I resonate about being in that space of limbo or liminality or whichever word we want to use. And so I'm really looking at what does that mean for the developmental journey of you as a systems thinker, that you now find yourself in a space in a space that is limbo of the not knowing. And what can you share from that place, from one systems thinker to another, or to a systems practitioner, or to a leader who's watching us right now and thinking, "Oh, I resonate with the limbo space and that sense, but how can maybe systems thinking do something, or how can I do something with systems thinking to live in this space of limbo?"
Um,
Oh, that was a big sigh.
it's a big question, Jennifer. You
Yeah.
ask,
Well, you
as
know
always,
me.
you ask
I'm
very
of
powerful
big
questions.
questions.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Uh, because so I mean, really, what I want to say, is, let it in, and uh, there's this, gosh, I don't want to end up. I'm going to end up doing a bit of a guru thing if what I really wanted to use was the word bardo instead of limbo, and more of a 1970s reference perhaps, but the Tibetan between worlds, and I know that liminal is the trend, is the cool thing to say now. So I'm wary of being too spiritual and trying to, anyway. Um, there is this open heart idea. When your heart is open is when you're very vulnerable and you're very often in pain. Um, and I think that, I suppose, the advice I would give, Jennifer, to systems thinkers and to systems leaders, whatever that means, as well, because I'm always thinking, am I doing enough service to your leadership headline, for your conference? Is that we try to do everything to avoid being in that vulnerable, open-hearted space. Well, I'm speaking for myself anyway. Um, and therefore, just being in it, um, and allowing it to be. You've got a when your heart is broken open, you're vulnerable, you're sensitive, you're in pain, but you're also sensitive. You can sense a huge amount of stuff, if you see what I mean. Yeah, and as I say, I think there's a way through, and I'm not sure if, when I was talking before, I think I set up the tension, but I didn't necessarily get to the way through. Maybe we won't. Maybe we will in the end. But
Yeah.
I'm saying, to my advice, since you asked for it, Jennifer, to people
Hmm.
in that space is, be in that space.
Yeah. Be in that space. Thank you for going there, because it's like we have a bit of similar things, and I say we because I recognize what you're saying.
Yeah.
Is, and I think that leaders also experience that a lot.
Yes. And try and
Is,
deny it like hell.
yeah, yeah, because it's not just a space of grief and of not knowing. What comes on top of it for many people is the fear of the vulnerability of that, and where do I end up if I really give in to actually being there? And actually, it reminds me slightly, and it's a strange comparison, because I find it actually a quite, in one way, a quite linear idea, but it does remind me of the hero's journey. and the part where you sort of go into crisis, you don't know how to solve the situation, so you're stuck. Um, so what do you feel about that comparison? Is
I
that similar?
I used to love it. Now I don't love it as much. I'll tell you why. I do want to just pause on for a second on the vulnerability thing.
Mm.
And again, I put into my bio coming from a position of privilege. If I'm not aware of it this year, then something wrong with me.
Yeah.
But in multiple dimensions, and probably everybody listening to this has multiple dimensions of privilege um, as well as other things going on.
Yeah.
Um, People run away from being in it for really good reasons, and so being in it does not mean um, uh, does not mean invite the destruction of yourself or your total breakdown.
Mm-hmm.
I should make that clear. If you have the privilege to be in it, then consider being in it. Is probably how I should rephrase my advice.
Yeah.
And I'm not using privilege in necessarily just a male, right, white, rich man. If in your context it's okay for you to be in it, then consider being in it.
Yeah.
That would
That's
be the
how you
point.
mean it. Yeah.
Yeah. So hero's journey plays into this really because I think that it's a really powerful way of seeing things. One of the people I interviewed for my podcast this year, which one of the problems with this year is I've had these amazing interviews and none of them are released because it's not been it hasn't happened for me that. So I've got all of this stuff holding on to do. Is a guy called Jeff Gomez from
Mm-hmm.
the entertainment industry who writes a blog called The Collective Journey.
Oh,
And
wow.
I'm really taken by this idea. We always end up talking in these conversations, Jennifer, with me saying I don't believe in these big kind of paradigm shifts, and then saying, but there's a really interesting paradigm shift going on.
I
um,
was going to say
uh,
we unpacked a couple of them in one of the previous conversations we had
yeah,
within the
exactly.
context of the summit. So we did
Yeah,
talk about that.
no, that's right. Well, this is I often find myself strongly denying something and then say, yeah, but of course that's true. Um, so the point about his concept, I'm not sure if he completely originated it, but he's very good on it and very clear on it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that we are seeing a culture, worldwide culture, driven by the entertainment industry, driven by media mix, the cross connecting of stories across different media, driven by omnipresence, that we can be in multiple. That's not exactly the phrase, but that we can exist in multiple dimensions at once.
Yeah.
Somebody can be watching this and on Twitter commenting about it and dealing with their family in their house, homeschooling probably at the moment. That we're moving in a lot of the stories that are being told by Hollywood and the whole entertainment industry from that hero's journey, which I just loved. Star Wars when I was 4 years old was I saw it like no 5 or 6 years old. I saw it 13 times in a single year. The power of that myth is undeniable. And it's still
Mm.
there.
Yeah.
Transcend and include means things don't ever go away. Um, uh, well, that's a big statement, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
And we're moving from the lone, probably male, probably white, uh, good hero fighting evil and winning in the end.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm aware that that's not the whole of the hero's journey, and that the hero's journey is actually about a long journey and then a return home, seeing things with fresh eyes, which is perhaps that denial of that's nonsense and that's not true, and this is why it's not true. And yes, of course, it's completely true. Um, uh, to a collective journey
Yeah.
where actually we move away from black and white and we get into shades of gray. And I just love the latest Star Wars trilogy for that, because you're actually seeing despite all the overblown multiple Death Stars and all that stupid stuff, you're seeing shades of gray in the good and evil side of the Force. And we're moving from a lone hero, even though
Yeah.
there is still a lone hero in the story, to a collective. And in all kinds of different types of culture, we're now seeing there's no non-player characters anymore, Jennifer, if that makes sense.
Mm.
And I think that is something to hold on to, because if understanding is embedded, if to understand is to know what to do, but I only know
Mm-hmm.
what to do if I know which story or stories, very
Mm-hmm.
important point, of which I am a part.
Yeah.
Then better explanatory stories, which are more open, more diverse, more inclusive, but more tension holding, more generative, um, embedded in community, in practice, can emerge. And I think that that's what we can offer right now. And we can't offer that probably as a guru or a popularizer. We can
Mm-hmm.
probably only offer that by being in community,
Yeah.
um, and by being engaged with other people, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
yes, you could paint my story, for what it's worth, and anybody's story, as a hero's journey, and there's a lot of validation, there's a lot of value, there's a lot of interest in that. That's not less real. But perhaps the collective story, collective journey, is
Mm-hmm.
more powerful and can include and transcend that one hero fighting through things. I don't know if I've gone, way off into realms of theory and philosophy that people won't find interesting.
No, no,
um,
not at all. Not at all. And it's a co-creation here anyway, in terms of also the questions that I throw at you, and so yeah, I trust that that sits well here. And I'm really with what you said about the stories, about the narratives, and how important it is to reside in the collective, and to see how we are on this collective journey, and the potential that it also holds for what we can bring as systems thinkers. And I want to elaborate on that a little bit more. But before I do, I want to get to what in all that, what in the narrative making, what is the wisdom that comes out of the narratives, specifically when we look at systems thinkers, or when you take yourself as an example as a systems thinker, what knowledge or wisdom comes from when you engage in the narratives in the collective space?
oh, that's really interesting. Um, there's a few things. So one of the things that I wanted to say is that I think this is what we're talking about now, is the resolution to that polarity,
Mm-hmm.
duality, let me say,
Yeah.
of, there appear to be systems in the world, and we can gain insights about how things not always, not every time, but predictably and with great reliability work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yet we also can get very clear as soon as we start to do this work and take it seriously. If you take any of this thinking seriously, you get to somewhat similar conclusions, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
That there's no system without an observer.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think the answer to that is in this different way of thinking about narratives, and it's circular. It works at different levels. So the first answer is epistemic humility, to coin a phrase. Um,
Okay. What does
so
that
so
mean?
what it means is, um, there is a the trade-off. If we're talking about a collective story, a collective journey, that doesn't mean that we are part of the Borg, the collective, the hive mind,
Okay.
in that strong sense. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but it means two things that go either side of that. One is that our only way of understanding is
Mm-hmm.
rooted in a collective shared meaning. Our only way of
Yeah.
making meaning is connected to that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, our perspective is only one amongst many. Um, and in those stories, you get great teamwork and all of that, but you get great conflicts and great tension, as well. And if
Yeah.
you take the no non-player characters thing seriously, then uh, then everybody is an equal. Everybody is a player. Everybody
Yeah.
has a valid perspective. If you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I think systems thinkers can bring that. I think systems thinkers, uh, uh, need to practice. It needs to be a practice. It needs to be really kind of embedded. It needs to be part of your life. if you're actually going to get there. So,
Mm-hmm.
if systems thinkers are lucky, what they can bring to that story is epistemic humility. I'm one view amongst many. That's that insight.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Perhaps sort of, I can, if I name this, the power to name things is a power that can be deeply misused. It can be used in a violent way. Naming things can engage the mob, but the power to name things where people suddenly go, this is how we shall understand it, and that's somehow
Mm-hmm.
enlivening, opening up of possibilities through
Yeah.
insight. That's what systems thinkers, I think, can bring. And if they're really lucky, I think the potential to bear witness to a more fruitful, richer, more human, more respectful ways of being together. And I know those are all just big words, so there you go. If that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, it does. It does. Um and actually I would like you to go into it a bit further, because I'm really looking at also, because we're talking about the developmental journey of a systems thinker. And so what do you think is the growing edge, even beyond that, what you just explained, for systems thinkers? Because you elaborated on what they can bring.
It's really interesting in this context that we're actually generating an adult apprenticeship in the UK, because of
Mhm.
course an apprenticeship model is designed to embed people in a practice, a craft.
Yeah.
So I think there's something in the developmental journey in, well, if the growing edge that systems thinkers can really bring
Mhm.
seems to me to be the potential to look at and work at several levels of scale, recursion, and logic, and find some balance between them. See the bigger picture, see the smaller picture,
Mhm.
see a different logical way of thinking about this, see how this plays out on a much longer time frame, those kind of things.
Yeah.
Um, then, then the developmental journey is, maybe we talked about this last time we spoke, Jennifer, on this in one of these interviews, but Terry Pratchett has this brilliant little bit about frogs that grow up in a tree leaf, and they just live in a bromeliad leaf in the rainforest, and
Mhm.
then one day they get to the edge of that leaf, and they think, the world, look, this is amazing. They've ever lived is inside that little leaf, and
Yeah.
then they see this enormous rainforest, and then the point is that, at some point later on, as they've been living in this rainforest and this broader world for a long time, they just look up a little bit further and they see the fringes of the bromeliad leaf around the world that they're now in. Do you see what I mean?
Mhm.
So I think it's constantly drawing attention to the next broader way of seeing that can encompass and include and support and make sense of all of the existing ones. Does
Yeah.
that make sense? And
Yeah.
that kind of
Yeah.
a developmental journey is really hard to craft, but it's really easy to live. if
Mm.
you have the first insight in the first place, and you keep looking for the trees at the leaf fringe at the edge of your reality.
Yeah. Yeah. And what comes up for me as you explain it, so beautifully explain it, is that you are unpacking and unraveling expanded consciousness. That's what it sounds like to me. And
Well, I tell you what, just to bring this, there was a Twitter meme yesterday that turned into something fun.
mm,
Um, and I'm really enjoying it. Feels like, what I didn't realize at first, Jennifer, is that I've just, discovered in this lockdown, in this period, all of these people who are kind of super intelligent. There's no fear of showing off. It's just having fun together and creating, and they're shit posting, excuse the language, just silly memes and funny things. And then it took me a while to go, oh, they're young people. I I hadn't actually twigged that all these people are so much younger than me, probably because I have a distorted belief in time and in my own age. So on Twitter, somebody had commented, lots of people criticizing why McKinsey is obsessed with number lists, like 7 things for, and I've done
Yeah.
it because I believe it's good marketing, but there you go.
Yeah.
And I just replied, oh, well, Buddhism got there first, as an attempt at a little joke. My jokes are avowedly not very good. I'm not bothered about them being very good or not, but it was funny to me. But that primed me. And then later in the day, I saw somebody on Twitter saying, isn't it interesting that Buddhism is all about these lists? And the fourfold, the eightfold path, and the Four Noble Truths, or is it the other way around?
Yes.
Et cetera, et cetera. And I replied, and I've got this brilliant graphic that's like, all of Buddhism on one infographic. It's quite hilarious with that as a little joke. And I said they were McKinsey before their time. And then somebody who I don't really know, Amir Haji Zamami, retweeted that with the quote, "All management philosophies will expand until they reinvent Buddhism," which was paraphrasing Zavinsky's law that all software will expand until it handles mail. So for me, that's just my playground, Jennifer. That's what
Yeah.
I love and enjoy, just all these ideas pinging in and this insight. Zavinsky's law is a systems law in some sense. There's a logic, it's capturing a logic of the underlying way things tend to go. But yeah, all systems thinking will expand until it reinvents Buddhism is very much in tune with what you just said, I think. It's perhaps a way to bring some bathos and some bring it down a level, because but it is the expanding of consciousness. You're right, and that's the weird thing about the expanding of consciousness is as soon as you think you've got this gloriously expanded consciousness, then you realize how wrong you are. So that's the developmental journey, and that's why the hero's journey is still relevant, but maybe in a broader context.
I've got one more question, because I want to I just asked you about the growing edge for systems thinkers. And I love how you just bring in what's happening in the contemporary, just a thing that happened yesterday on Twitter, and then contextualize that into what's the growing edge and what's expanding consciousness, and what's our role in that as systems thinkers. And just one step further, and that is, what's your growing edge with the current backdrop of what's happening globally, what's happening locally, limbo? What's your growing edge? Where are you looking at the edges of the leaves? And
I mean, yes, good question. I come back to that epistemic humility thing, and I think that better ways of thinking will emerge from acting in better ways, and vice versa. We came up in the summer, we were working with a lot of local organizations, local government and public services, and so on, thinking about how to build back better in the days after the pandemic, if those days ever arrive. And we had a phrase that I really like: the ethic that arises through diverse interactions in good faith. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to combine that understanding with an understanding that the more you decenter yourself, in science, we've moved from self-centered to human-centered to earth-centered, sun-centered to, I guess, universe non-centered. There's something about the humbler you get, the more genuine power you have. There's something about respecting autonomy. I'm trying to find a way through to make a clear statement about there's a really nice, and this ties into the hero's journey, collective journey thing. There's a really nice idea in progression that you go from dependent to independent to interdependent. That's nice. I think what we're trying to talk about these days is interdependence. So there is a sort of a next step, which again is a sort of expanding of consciousness, which is about holding our independence and I suppose that's what interdependence is supposed to mean, but interdependence becomes about almost, it chimes with me with the tight supply lines that have broken down because of I'm not even going to go into the deep self-harm that my country, the UK, is doing to itself at the moment. It would be a terrible
Mm.
end to an interview. But let's just say the pandemic. um,
Yeah.
so there's something about being independent and dependent, but not completely interdependent. Something about the autonomy and the connection that I'm struggling for. That's definitely
Yeah.
my learning edge. And all of this can give you sort of real powerful practical knowledge of how to achieve shared outcomes in complexity.
Yeah.
So I'd like to think that I'm trying to work towards a reframing that helps to capture that story that I've just sketched out.
Benjamin, we have been talking about the developing journey of a systems thinker. And I really want to thank you for putting in so much of yourself also in and being in reflective mode also about where you find yourself as a systems thinker uh, in relation to and also next to where you see the growing edge of systems thinking and what the potential of systems thinking is that we're invited to unpack. So thank you
Thank you,
so
Jennifer.
much
It's
for
been a real
sharing
pleasure.
today.
And as always, you got really interesting questions that generated some really something. I'm going to have to go away and try and process all of this now and make sense of our conversation. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
Right. Well, let's do some collective meaning making also. But not before I say thank you so much, Benjamin, for being on and for sharing. And to everyone who's been watching, let's go to the online community space and explore uh, independent interdependence and what our growing edges are as systems thinkers. If you dare to bring that out into our community space, I really look forward to seeing you there. Thank you so much for watching today. See you next session. Bye bye.